Okay, so without further ado, I'll keep my introduction very short since we lost some time. But this is Professor James Nieh that we are extremely happy to receive here in Constance. I've actually been following Professor Nieh's work for years now, and the papers coming out of his lab are always well thought and very interesting. So I'm really, really happy to finally get to meet him in person. Actually, it's the first time that we get to talk, really. So this is really nice, and I'm sure you will see all of this during his talk that is going to present some really interesting experiments to us. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. And I'd like to thank Morgan for inviting me, and also Giovanni for hosting me as well. It's really a pleasure to come here to your beautiful university. I want to talk today about the evolution of bee communication, something that I've been interested in for a very long time, because it's something that von Frisch referred to the honeybee waggle dance as this magic well from which you could continue to draw information even after many years of studying it. And I think this is a good example. So I wanted to go back even farther to Charles Darwin, who talked about the eternal struggle in nature between the instinct of one to escape. So there's also a struggle within Zoom, not only between predator and prey. But I also wanted to bring this into a new concept. So we now talk about fitness landscapes and the fit of phenotype. For example, we discuss this a great deal in viral or molecular evolution. But what exactly is going on here? We have this organism, symbolized here by these gray dots, and it's adapting to a changing fitness landscape. But this can simply be thought of as the arms race between predator and prey, because as the prey, in this case a honeybee, is adapting to the different strategies of the predator, so is the fitness landscape changing. So this is not a new concept. And the big picture of my talk today is that competition between species, as well as predator-prey relationships, create a dynamic fitness landscape. So I guess it's a fancy way to think about what Charles Darwin has spoken of from the very beginning, that the predator and prey are influencing each other's evolution. So I have three stories to talk about today. How have arms races influenced the evolution of bee communication? So looking at predators, competitors, and alarm calls. Whoops. I'm just going to stick with this. Bee signaling predators and complex signals that may require learning. So first one is about predators, competitors, and shouting stop. So this was work that I did in San Diego, California at UCSD. And we started with a feeder competition experiment. So this is the beginning of the competition trial. We have the focal bees labeled, and we have competitors, feral bees that are unmarked. And this is what happens by the end of the trial. You may have seen this here if you try to train bees at a certain time of year. It's very crowded, and some of the bees are fighting back to control the feeder, and some of the bees are losing and being attacked. When this happens, and this actually started when I was an undergraduate during my summer research experience, you observe a very interesting signal inside the nest. Okay, let's test that. Okay, so that seems to work. Excellent. So what you hear is this beeping sound, which I call the stop signal, because the bees that receive the signal freeze and stop. And the bees that normally receive the signal are the waggle dancers. And so this signal occurs when something bad has gone on at the food source. And I wanted to show you in particular what we found in this experiment. So here is a normal bee feeding at the feeder before and after. This is the control. And there's no change in any of the behaviors. When we have that bee as an attacker, when she's attacking another bee to keep control of this crazy feeder, there is also no change really in signaling. And we looked at the number of these stop signals, the number of waggle circuits per hive visit, so how good she thinks the food is, the number of visits with tremble dancing, and how long she's visiting the nest. But if she's the victim, if she's attacked by another bee, she will come back and significantly increase the number of stop signals that she produces. She, not surprisingly, reduces the number of waggle dances, and she also increases the number of tremble dances. So the stop signal is telling the waggle dancer to stop dancing when the food source has become dangerous in this case. Now, we also did other experiments in which we took tweezers, as shown here, and we pinched the bee. And here's the number of stop signals per hive visit. You can see that when a bee is pinched, as if she's attacked, she increases the number of signals, and she also decreases waggle dancing. We also took sting gland, and we administered a volatile honeybee sting gland extract here. You can see the bee is moving away, and bees that smell danger also increase the number of stop signals, but don't really change their other behaviors. And then finally, as a control, we provided the mandibular gland, which is not an alarm pheromone, and you see there's no change in their behaviors at all. So one problem is that this very seldom happens, except potentially if the hive is being robbed. So what is a natural context for this kind of danger? Well, we have wasps, in this case yellow jackets. We have spiders that are lurking on the flowers to attack the bees. And we also designed a robot predator, which are tweezers, which provide the same amount of pressure when they're activated. And this is a work of my master's student, Tyler Jack McCulloch. And you can see that when bees are presented with a dead spider or a dead wasp, they do not increase stop signals. When they have a live spider or wasp or the robot predator attacking them, then they increase the number of stop signals. So it is a response to peril of being attacked by another bee or by a predator. Okay. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this, because this is an older story, is to link it with something quite fascinating. We all know that the waggle dance is referential, so it encodes the quality of the food, the distance to the food, and the direction to the food. The stop signal inhibits the waggle dance. It stops bees from going to that location because the waggle dancer produces fewer dance circuits when she gets the stop signal, as you saw in that video. Is it possible that the stop signal can communicate how dangerous it actually is? So in response to greater danger, we know that chicken alarm calls are shorter, louder, and lower in frequency. Chickadee calls are higher pitched. Lemurs, as shown here, give alarm vocalizations that increase in frequency. And even the social mongoose, their alarm calls can vary with different danger. So can the stop signal communicate danger level? This is Vespa velutina, this hornet that you see right here. But this is Vespa mandarinia, which is significantly larger than Vespa velutina. So does this elicit a different signal? So in these experiments, we follow the classic von Frisch technique of training bees to a feeder and marking them individually. We would take these hornets and control them by putting them on a wire and present them either at the nest entrance, here they form a bee ball, or at the feeder to see what the bees would do. And then this is the work of now Professor Dong Shihao recording inside an observation nest. So, is the larger hornet actually more dangerous? Well, if you place the larger hornet at a feeder, what you'll see is that significantly more bees stop foraging at that feeder. About half the bees stop foraging for the Vespa velutina. And in this case, remember, they can't actually kill the bees because the dead bees don't do very much inside the nest. And so we want to see how they respond. In this one, I talked about the heat balling, and I'll go into that a little bit further later on. They perform a defensive ball around the hornet, and they generate heat, and it helps to kill the hornet. So the number of bees balling the hornet is significantly larger, up to 400, around the large hornet as compared to the small hornet. And there's a real cost. The number of bees that die in the process of defending the nest is significantly greater for the large hornet. So the large hornet is dangerous. By the way, if you model this as an ellipsoid and you calculate the surface area, you find that it's perfect. This is exactly the right number of bees to completely cover the body of the hornet. So they're also not wasting their resources as well. Okay. So it turns out the stop signal does have referential characteristics. There are two different contexts here. One is which they're attacking the forager, and the second one where they're attacking the nest. But regardless of the context, the large hornet elicits a stop signal that sounds like this. Okay, I'll do that again. Okay, I guess I can't repeat that, so I'm going to mute it. But you heard the beep, and then you heard the slightly lower pitch beep. And so it turns out that the larger hornet elicits a higher frequency stop signal. But context does matter in terms of the type of attack. So when it's attacking the nest, whether it's the large hornet or the small hornet, the duration of the stop signal is longer. So for example, for this large hornet, it would go beep. And for the small hornet, it would go beep. So the duration of the signal communicates the context, whether it's inside or at the nest entrance, or whether or not it is actually at the feeder. Okay, so this indicates that the stop signal does have referential characteristics, but we actually need to test that in a playback experiment. So I will say that I originally thought the frequency difference mattered. This is the vibrational sensitivity curve to these sounds, which are received as vibrations. And you can see that bees are slightly more sensitive to the stop signal of the large hornet, which is higher frequency, than the stop signal of the low hornet. But notice the air bars. That can't really explain the response because the sensitivity is not significantly different for these different frequencies. In fact, it's simply that it's louder. It's 1.6 times louder for the large hornet. And maybe that extra energy in generating a louder signal results in it shifting to a higher frequency. So we developed a playback device shown here in which we press this wand, generating a vibration against the comb, not against the bees. Sometimes bees get the stop signal when the comb next to them is vibrated. If you poke a bee with this, unfortunately, the bee will just run away. So that's why we administer the comb. And you can see that the small hornet here is inhibiting the number of dance circuits by about 50%, but the large hornet inhibits it by significantly more, which perhaps is not too surprising because it's louder. And in this experiment, we gave bees stop signals until they actually completely stopped waggle dancing. And you can see that on average, we had to give about 14 signals to a dancer for the small hornet and about 4 signals to the large hornet. So it is effective. You might wonder why it is the dancer doesn't just believe the bee after one signal and leave, but keep in mind that a bee can be mistaken. It may make a mistake about how dangerous it is. And even if it is dangerous, at certain times of year, maybe everything is dangerous, so the bee still has to go out and collect food for the colony. And keep in mind that even if they lose one forager out of 1,000, it may not be a huge cost for the colony. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a new study that we recently published this year, looking at the effects of dopamine. So if we look at brain dopamine content, we see that this is the control. The waggle dancer has higher levels. This is consonant with what was recently published in a science paper. Bees that receive the stop signal, their dopamine level immediately drops. And the stop signaler, a bee that's been attacked by a hornet, also has a low level of dopamine. This is Vespa mandarinia, and this is the bee. Now, what if we increase dopamine by feeding the bees L-dopa in the sugar solution? Well, first of all, it does significantly increase the dopamine concentration in the bee brain, and it also does a few other things. Essentially, the bees appear to lose their fear of the hornet. When a bee is attacked, but is not boosted in dopamine, she will spend most of her time inside the nest and not go back to the feeder. The dopamine bees don't care. They go back and feed. They will actually waggle dance for the feeder. They will not produce any stop signals, even though they're attacked by the hornet, but the control bees do. And they will spend significantly more time feeding and collecting food. So it's as if they ignore the hornet, and that's what you'll see in this video. Okay, let me try that again. So, by the way, the reason why the hornet is not attacking is it's connected by a wire, so it can't attack. But normally, a bee that encounters this hornet would immediately fly away. And it's, as you see, she's feeding. She doesn't care at all. So, in summary for this story, why a negative feedback signal? An individual's experience at food can interrupt her own foraging and recruitment. So she's been attacked. She's not going to advertise this dangerous location. But there are other bees that could still be dancing inside the nest. So that's the idea. She's providing the news that it's dangerous at that food source, and that's the function of the stop signal. Although I should say that the stop signal can also be used in the context of looking for a nest site, but it still has the same function. It's inhibiting the waggle dance. In this case, of your competitors who are dancing for real estate that's not as good. So I wanted to move on to another aspect of signaling, bees signaling the predator. And this is an AI-generated thing. I asked it to imagine bees defending the castle-like nest. In any kind of prolonged evolutionary interaction between predator and prey, you would expect at some point that if the prey have some honest way of escaping or defending themselves, they should evolve a signal to warn the predator, because then the predator doesn't waste its time. Think about the deer showing the white tail as they run away from the wolf. That's signaling to the wolf, it's useless to try to pursue me. I'm going to be able to run away. Okay. And strangely enough, that's what we see here. So this is Vespa velutina. Every morning in this part of China, they come and they check out the colonies, and then they run away. But why? Why would they do that? And this was work done with my collaboration with Ken Tan in Yunnan. And one thing which is very nice is right here. This is Vespa velutina larvae. And the great thing is you can buy it in the marketplace because people find it delicious. It actually tastes like stir-fried shrimp. Okay, so it's readily available, and they have this very interesting behavior. You won't hear the sound, but it's not important for this one. If you bring the hornet close to the nest, at about 4 centimeters away, what will happen is the bees will form a ball around it. And they will furiously begin to generate body heat. In this image, you can kind of see them as they're moving around. And this is most clear. They are pumping their abdomens, generating carbon dioxide inside the ball, generating heat, and they're also blocking the spiracles of the hornet, preventing it from breathing well. And they also try to sting. The hornet is heavily armored, but we found that they can sting through the neck. And the sting, in combination with all these factors, makes it more fatal for the hornet. So, as I just said, there's elevated temperature and carbon dioxide inside the ball. And this is found in many different subspecies of Apis mellifera and also in Apis cerana. And it's possible, even for the Italian variety of a ligustica, to heat ball sympatric hornets or wasps like Vespa crabo. Now, Apis mellifera currently, because there's a problem with Vespa velutina, invasive species, has a weak and small heat-balling defense against the allopatric Vespa velutina. This is one of the problems why this species is such an invasive threat. Okay, so first what they did is they found a way to chemically sample it. So this is a quartz glass tube containing a steamy fiber in which they can sample the odors during the initiation of a heat ball. And what we see is we find hornet alarm pheromone with these 3 compounds, and initially we find honeybee alarm pheromone, which then dominates because you have one hornet and you have many bees furiously producing alarm pheromone. So here we see a heat ball, and here you can see the hornet right there in the orange. And what you see here is the number of heat-balling bees comparing between Apis cerana in white and Apis mellifera in gray. In the control, there are basically no bees on the hornet. In response to the hornet alarm pheromone, which we were able to isolate and present in a synthetic form since we'd previously analyzed it, we see significantly greater number of Apis cerana, but not Apis mellifera. In response to the sting pheromone of the bee species, there is an increase in heat balling, and in the live hornet, you have the greatest response of all. So we think it's something about the motion of the hornet that actually elicits the most bees interested in heat balling. And in this one, you actually see an increase finally in Apis mellifera being interested. I think for us, one very interesting thing was that Apis cerana, but not Apis mellifera, can eavesdrop, meaning that it can detect a chemical signal that has not evolved for its species. It doesn't use these compounds that the hornet produces for alarm pheromone, but it is able to detect them and respond by forming a heat ball. You can see that Apis mellifera doesn't have a response to this hornet alarm pheromone. Well, we can actually take a look using EAG, as shown here. We have the antenna of the bee, and we're recording from it electrically. So here we have the different components of the hornet alarm pheromone. And what we can see is interesting to this nonantuone and undecantuone, but also to other unidentified peaks in the hornet alarm pheromone, we begin to see depolarizations and responses in the antenna of Apis cerana, but only in Apis cerana. I should say this is one hornet or one wasp equivalent. If you obviously ramp it up, then you begin to see responses from both species. But here, Apis mellifera has no strong response at all. So the idea here is they are able to detect and have been selected to detect the hornet alarm pheromone. Okay, again, luckily we don't need to have sound for this one. I wanted to show you the warning signal that I'm talking about, because the bee can form a heat ball and kill the hornet, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So you're seeing this in slow motion. These bees are swaying their abdomens, and there's a slight vibration of the wings, which in real time you will see is much more conspicuous, at least to us. And so normally the hornet is flying around, but in this case we can control it for our experiments. Okay, so now we're getting to the actual speed. Here we go. And you can see this flickering of the abdomen and also of the wings. This is a behavior which is similar in what you see in Apis florii and Apis dorsata, but this is specific for Apis cerana. So here you see it in real time, and we have the bees hanging out the entrance, and we have the hornet. The hornet can't run away in this case because it's attached to the wire. And what we looked at is we randomly took one bee and compared it to another bee in terms of the start time of what we call this ICU signal, meaning I detect you as a predator, and I'm going to show you that I see you, and also the stop time. And as you can see, they're extraordinarily well synchronized. So they're acting in synchrony. But what is triggering the behavior? Are they smelling the hornet, or are they seeing the hornet? To answer this question, we performed a video playback experiment. So we provide the video screen of the honeybee, in this case, that is producing the ICU signal, and we see what the other bees do. And what you'll see is that when this guy vibrates and does the signal, these other bees respond. So it doesn't have to do with alarm pheromone, because this bee could be producing alarm pheromone, but obviously the screen is not. It's not even the electrostatic signature of the bee, because this is going to be very different from a real bee. It's simply visually seeing another bee producing this signal. Now, in addition to causing the bee to produce the ICU signal, the guards are attracted to video playbacks. So when we have the playback, the guard bees will rush towards the bee that's producing the signal and then repeat it. And remember, they're synchronized, so they're repeating it in synchrony. Now, one thing that we can do with the video playbacks is we can compare its response to controls or to the actual hornet. So this is the number of signals, and you can see that when we play back the butterfly at different speeds, it has no response. This is a sympatric butterfly that's normally found in this environment. Now here, if we look at the bee, we can see that when it's too slow, they don't really respond. When it's too fast, they also don't respond. It has to be at exactly the right speed, and then they will start to produce the signals. For the hornet itself, they're less discriminating. If it's played back at 1 time speed or 2 times speed, they will still produce the ICU signal. So, relevant video playbacks will trigger the signal. They're responding to relevant motions of a predator. But when it comes to a bee, the bee has to do it exactly correctly. And this makes sense because you don't want to respond to any random motions of a bee, but a bee doing it in the correct way. And so the idea here is it's contagious and synchronized, and it is therefore selective. You need to find a bee that is actually doing the signal for you to rush forward and actually start producing the signal. So what's going on in this picture that we saw initially? Well, the bee detects the hornet by visually seeing it. That's sufficient. The bee will then produce the ICU signal, which visually attracts other bees in the colony, guard bees, and they will all produce the signal in synchrony, without actually even a hornet being there. So this is what I mean by it's being visually contagious. It would be like you, say, hearing someone shout fire, but you don't check for smoke or fire, you just start screaming fire as well. In this case, the hornet is repulsed. Why is that? If you only have a couple of bees doing the signal, the hornet doesn't care because it knows the colony is too weak to actually defend itself. And there is the honesty of the signal, that enough bees have to be synchronized to let the hornet know that they can defend themselves in a coordinated way. And because all of the bees are obviously genetic related in a colony, they share the same self-interest, which should reduce the problem of what you might call the boy who cried wolf. I think was originally a German folktale, right? But in any case, that somebody is going to create a false alarm because they all have the shared same interest. So I wanted to talk about the final story, which is about the waggle dance, and about the idea that some of these complex signals might need a lot of learning. When I was a student and I first learned about the honeybee waggle dance, it was actually why I did that original summer research on the stop signal. And I was very fascinated, and the first thing I asked my professor, who was actually Bert Holdobler, you might be familiar, and I asked him, well, but do they learn it, or are they born knowing how to do it? And that was a question that he said, we don't really know yet. And now we have a better answer. So this work was also done in Yunnan, China. And again, it is the work of Dong Shihao, which I wanted to show this picture. He came from a very mountainous village. Your parents exaggerate by saying how hard it was to go to school. So he would actually have to walk 12 hours to go to school. And it was so bad that in the winter, he would actually live there in a small town. So he was incredibly resilient. This is him with his proud parents. And I think a lot of this resilience was necessary for how to do this experiment, which I will tell you. And if you've ever worked with honeybees, you're probably going to think this is a crazy experiment to actually try. The first question, though, I wanted to ask is, what is the value of cultural transmission? We as humans learn a lot culturally. For example, in your courses right now, you're probably learning about neurobiology or different aspects of biology. Wouldn't it be great if you were just born knowing all of that? You wouldn't have to go to class. And there are, in humans, this is an image of a movie in which children were raised because all their parents died in nuclear war. They would have to create their own culture, but also recreate a lot of what was known and lost. So culture is actually bad because if all the adults die, what will you do? It's interesting that there are multiple examples of cultural signals in animals. So in naked mole rats, they share vocalizations within a colony. Killer whales that live in a family pod, they share the sounds that their mothers will make, and this is, we think, useful for distinguishing where a whale comes from. Humpback whales, the males, you might know, sing songs that can change seasonally, and they will have themes that can transmit over multiple whales over thousands of miles as they migrate along. Corn buntings are birds that have cultural transmission, and also ravens as well. But the question was, is some aspect of this cultural transmission of signals, does it work in honeybees? And this gets me back to the question of learning to dance. So here we have the waggle dancer, and here we have followers, following the dancer. But I chose this figure to show you that the dance floor is very irregular. It is naturally made in natural colonies, and they don't use cone foundation. So in many ways, in each colony, the dance floor is somewhat unique. And we know that this affects the accuracy of bee communication. So is it possible that bees can learn how to dance better? In this case, learning how to navigate a dance floor. Another reason why I wanted to show you this is that you may know that the bee is pointing in the direction of the food source relative to the sun. She is indicating the duration by the duration of her waggle run, and the number of repetitions says how good the food is. She's doing this on a vertical surface, moving at 1 body length per second, so it's like climbing, and it's not a flat surface. She has to grab onto these edges of the cells in order to communicate correctly, and she's doing this in the complete dark. So it's quite a challenging task. Another thing that I wanted to bring out is this idea that different honeybee species have different dialects. Specifically, if we consider the waggle phase here, this is a diagram that I've adopted from Patrick Cole et al., in which we look at 2 different habitats. So in species 1, it lives in a more tropical environment, for example, and it only has to forage over a short distance, let's say 1 kilometer, in order to get most of the food that the colony needs. Species 2, though, lives in a more arid, desert-like environment, and it has to forage over a longer distance. So you would expect that the encoding, defined as the relationship between the waggle phase duration and the distance to the resource, that this is tuned to the kind of environment that the bee is in. And in fact, we find this generally that there is evidence for this kind of encoding. Okay. So let me talk about the experiment and why this was so crazy. So we created single cohort colonies. Basically, we took a mother colony, we brought in the comb, and we created in the incubator the emerged 2,600 bees that we used to create a colony that was stocked with honey and pollen and a new queen. From the remainder of that mother colony, we took bees of all ages, 2,600, also with food and honey, and also with a new queen. So they started out very similar, except that in the control colony, they had bees of all ages. The experimental colony, everyone was the same age. Bees have age polyethism, so they become foragers as they get older, and as a young age, they're all nurse bees. The other interesting thing is Hiroyuki Ai found that all foragers in his study followed waggle dancers when they were young bees before they ever tried to forage, before they began moving towards the nest entrance and were flying out. So this was an interesting suggestion that maybe the reason they're following the waggle dancers is because they want to learn about waggle dancing or learn where the food source is. So, okay. What is crazy about the experiment is you create these bees. In each of the colonies, you mark 200 bees, and you have students that come in every day before dawn at 5 a.m. until after dusk, and they watch every single bee. Because they need to know the first time that that bee is moving to the entrance and getting ready to become a forager. And that would happen about 12 to 13 days of age. It's quite young, but remember the distribution of foraging is a distribution, and we had to look at the first time the youngest bees were trying to go out and forage. And then you take that bee, you gently capture it, you transport it to a feeder, you release it, and you train it. And then you watch the first time it comes back, and you hope that it waggle dances, which, if you've ever worked with bees, probably doesn't work very well. So this experiment took a lot of work to figure out and get those very first dances. But this is what the very first dance of a control bee looks like. So here you can see that she's dancing, and she's pointing fairly consistently in the same direction, although there is some spread, because naturally there is air in the communication of direction. Okay. This is the bee in the learning-deprived colony, meaning that it could never follow the dances of more experienced bees because there were no more experienced bees. All the bees were the same age, and hopefully you can see that there is a greater spread in the directions that that bee is communicating. So here is the waggle dance. I won't review it with you because I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it. But here's the directional accuracy. So this is the waggle run divergence angle, and these are the first dances, E1, of naive bees, and you can see they have a significantly greater spread in the waggle angle. We then looked at the same bees when they were 20 days older, because they were all individually marked. We trained them to the feeder again, and we found that they had recovered. So either by watching other bees or by practicing, they were able to reduce this waggle divergence angle error. Because remember, pointing in a greater number of directions would result in recruits going in different directions, which is not as good. Now here in the control bees, these are the first dances, and these bees were all, in our experiment, following older dancers before they themselves waggle danced. They were equally as good as when they were 20 days older. And by the way, this is close to the terminal lifespan of a forager when they should be very experienced. So they never had the same problem of the divergence angle. So bees without demonstrators also had greater distance error, but the distance error manifests itself slightly differently. So this is the waggle run duration. In the control bees, for the distance encoding that we would expect, this is how long they should have waggle danced. For some reason, in our experimental colonies, they communicated a distance that was too far away, and they never recovered. They never recovered. They continued to communicate a distance that was too far away, even when they were much older and more experienced as foragers. Here you can see the duration range error. We look at the longest and the shortest waggle in each dance performance, and we subtract them, and you can see the duration range error is higher in the E1 bees. Gets a little bit better, but not significantly different as they get older, but it is worse here than in the control colonies. Okay, so here we have the number of waggles per waggle run, and what you can see here, this should be correlated with the distance, the duration of time spent waggling, and it is, same pattern. And here's something really interesting. Remember, we're getting the first waggle dance of the first foraging, the first time the bee has actually left the nest, actually. In the E1 bees, they spent significantly longer flying back. We didn't have harmonic radar, so we couldn't see what they're doing. It's quite possible they traveled a greater distance. In some ways, it's surprising they were able to come back. It was only 140 meters away because it was their first flight outside the nest. But when they were older, they spent the normal amount of time, as did the control bees. So it's possible that this greater time they spent outside the nest related somehow to their communicating a greater distance. But it's puzzling that this persisted even when they were older. So what else did we find? So there was a tendency for dancers to communicate higher quality in older, larger colonies, we think because there may have been greater need for food to feed the larger number of bees. So this is encoded by the number of waggle runs, which is higher when the bees, when the colonies were larger. Not significant in the control colonies, but somewhat of a trend. And this is looking at the duration of the waggle return phase, which should also be faster, shorter, if the food is higher quality. Here we didn't see very many differences at all. Now, we then looked at dance disorder. This is something I never thought about, but what they found in China is that bees would sometimes feed on toxic nectar of this plant called the thunder god vine. It actually is used to make a traditional Chinese medicine. The flowers in here bloom at a time of year when other flowers are not available, so bees often have no choice. And when they come back, they perform disordered dances. So a normal waggle dance would be waggle, turn right, waggle, turn left. And there would be an alternation of right, left, right, left. But when they were intoxicated with this nectar, they would do right, 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 left, or left, 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 right. They would not do it in the regular, orderly way. And so you can quantify that. And you can see that dance disorder was significantly higher in the E1 dances, but they recovered when they got older, and the control bees all had the correct amount of dance disorder. In terms of the number of dance followers, we had the same in the experimental colonies, whether they were young or older, slightly more in the C2 colony. This may have been because there was greater need for food and there were more foragers. Okay, is there a link between these two different errors that we've seen? So here we have dance disorder, And then also we have the divergence angle, communicating directional error. So what we see in general, this is not true for all of them, I've broken them down by each type of bee, but particularly for the E1 bees that are shown here, there is a good correlation between their disordered dances and their communication of greater divergence angles if they are more disordered. By the way, you might wonder, as I did, what is the function of being orderly in producing the waggle dance? But if you've watched the waggle dance, you know it occurs very rapidly, and the followers, in some ways, may have to predict which way the dancer is going to turn. So it might be helpful for the followers to follow a waggle dancer that's doing regular alternations instead of irregular ones. That's a hypothesis that remains to be shown, though. Okay, so without social learning, the directional error increases, the distance error increases, they're overshooting, the dance disorder increases, and the directional error correlates with dance disorder. Well, now we know that directional and distance disorder errors decrease with time and experience. But the distance error is fixed for life, which is similar in many of these other animals to a kind of sensitive stage. And we're working on another experiment right now that will actually show cultural transmission, we hope. Our preliminary data shows that if in these colonies that were communicating the wrong distance consistently, you bring a new generation of young bees, the young bees learn the incorrect distance encoding, which is quite interesting. But that brings us to the question of why should the dance dialect be culturally transmitted? And I wanted to point out this figure. So it's not only true that different species live in different habitats, it's also true that Apis mellifera ligustica could live in different habitats. It could live in a habitat where there's a lot of food, or it can live in a habitat where there's very little food. And if we required evolution in terms of changing the genetic makeup of the waggle phase encoding, it would take a long time for a colony to adapt to a new circumstance. One potential advantage of cultural transmission is it could learn it and then pass it on within 1 or 2 generations. So that's a reason for it, but of course we have to do experiments. So right now our next steps are first to look at the terrain hypothesis. If you look at this closely, this is a crazy waggle dance floor. It's actually corrugated, so it should be very difficult for bees to dance upon. We predict that with experience, they will actually perform better, more accurate dances once they're familiar with this crazy surface. And then the next experiment is the cultural transmission hypothesis, which I mentioned, bringing in a cohort of new bees and seeing if they learn. But the real experiment is to actually take colonies with different dance dialects, and there is variation even within Apis mellifera, one from a habitat where food is close by and one from a habitat where food is more rare, and swap them and see how rapidly, within how many generations, their distance encoding would actually change. So that would be a challenging experiment, but it would be quite exciting to be able to do. So I wanted to summarize in our remaining time, I think we're almost on time, is that in many ways I think that the honeybee system remains a magic well for understanding evolution, particularly if we think about what it takes to create an accurate signal and what it needs to do in response to predators or dangers. So I talked about referential stop signals in response to predators, the large or the small hornet. And I don't think that they're communicating large hornet, small hornet. I think they're communicating big danger, small danger, which is what is true in most of the other animal systems we know this about. In terms of warning to predators, we would predict the evolution of a warning signal, which is what we've actually found. And moreover, it's an honest warning signal. So mathematical simulations, but also other discussions have shown that these signals should on average be honest, because after all, why would the predator believe you if you were always lying? And that's exactly why we think the ICU signal needs to be contagious, but also very conspicuous. Okay, and then finally, we talked about the bees are able to learn to improve their waggle dance. So the answer to the question that I asked Bert Haldobler over 30 years ago is they are born with the ability to waggle dance, but they can improve by following other dancers. There is a mystery here, though. If you think of, and if you look at the waggle dance and you look at the behavior of the dance followers are not waggle dancing. They're just following. And it's interesting that that behavior itself should allow them to improve their own waggle dance the very first time they do it. It's, for example, if you were learning how to do the Viennese waltz or something like that, and you're just following the dancing people, it wouldn't give you a really good idea of actually how to waltz. So how that all works is quite interesting, but obviously we know that the followers are able to transform the information from the dance in their brains somehow into the correct coordinates. Okay, and then do bees learn about danger? I wanted to bring this up because when we did this experiment in the winter, when there were no hornets, but the bees were still active, even though we provided the video playbacks, they didn't respond. So there seems to be some kind of seasonality where when there actually are hornets, then they will produce the signal. But when the colony doesn't expect them or hasn't been attacked by them, those workers do not respond. So I wanted to thank the many people who've contributed to these experiments, particularly my Chinese collaborators in the Chem10 lab, my own lab, to the dancing bees themselves, and to our funding agencies. Thank you. So, any questions?
So this is a really wonderful look into some things to do with the evolution of the waggle dance. It kind of reminded me of a question that's been bothering me a lot over recent years, and I'd like to hear your opinion on how do you think such a thing as the waggle dance actually evolves? How do we go from foragers returning, dropping off honey and going back to the flower, to foragers that are passing on information through a stereotype behavior?
So this is the question that I think every honeybee researcher would like to answer. And beginning with von Frisch, the basic hypothesis is, I think, in some ways the simplest one, that the waggle dancer is drawing a little map of where she is going. And especially if this occurs on horizontal surfaces, and there are honeybee species that primarily dance on horizontal surfaces, she's pointing at the direction of the food source. But even more interesting, if you look at flies and the work of Dethier, who probably is not studied much anymore, but he was a pioneer in this work, he showed in some very early experiments that if you feed a fly sugar solution and then you force it to walk on a surface, it will actually walk in a way pointing in the direction of the sugar solution, which makes a lot of sense, right? But what if you then flip it vertically? How weird would that be? It's for some reason takes the vertical to mean I'm going in the direction of the sugar solution. Now that experiment unfortunately hasn't been repeated, but if that's true, you have in essence the early using the upward direction of gravity as meaning going in the direction of the food source, which you could see being transformed into its direction relative to the sun. I agree there are huge gaps in that, but I think it's fascinating that what von Frisch wrote about in the 1920s is still a basic hypothesis about how this all started.
Yeah, very fascinating. I'm sure we could listen to 3 more hours of really fascinating bee experiments. I have one specific question about the culture, and especially about the overshooting during the waggle dances, because I'm wondering, could you see if the bees are overshooting, or are they just generating kind of a new agreement on how many waggle runs or waggle duration actually means 400 or 300 meters, and they kind of make a new metric system, so to say, for what that means. In the sense, then the next it goes to the point that if the next generation then learns this, doesn't it make sense that they learn it if otherwise they might be, so to say, undershooting where the old bees want to go? I think That was very badly phrased, but I think you understand what I mean.
No, I understand. And so I should say something really interesting. I recently went to an entomology conference, and I was given the presentation of a student. So there is a lot of variation in the waggle dance. I think everybody who studies it would say, and as you know, there's been in the past quite a controversy about whether it communicates everything. Part of the variation is that even within a colony, there is some difference in the distance encoding that different foragers do. And this was Margaret Covillon's student who found that, strangely enough, bees like to follow the dances of other bees that have the same distance encoding. So how strange within a colony. Well, first of all, how would they know? And she hasn't been able to answer that yet. But hopefully when the paper comes out, they'll have a better answer. I think the idea is that there might be an optimal distance encoding for that colony in that environment. And you're right, the dance followers should know that encoding in order to optimize their finding of the food. The other problem, though, is we know there's a lot of error and imprecision in the waggle dance, and so they rely upon other mechanisms, notably using odor to find the actual food source as well. So I would say that on average for a colony, particularly looking at the population level of colonies, this kind of tuning to the location of foods and the optic flow typically found in that environment should provide a slight advantage. But if you look at any individual colony or even individual waggle dancer, it may not matter too much in terms of going and finding food. Ken Tan did an experiment where he cross-fostered the bees. You take Cerana, which has a different encoding, and Mellifera, and you put a comb of Mellifera brood inside the Cerana colony. They grow up in it, and the Mellifera do the Mellifera encoding, and the Cerana do the Cerana encoding. So it's not really that labile, but there is some flexibility in there. Oh, and the big question is, which we didn't study in this experiment, is do the recruits get there? And they found they did. Even though they were confused by having different encodings, the other air compensating mechanisms enabled the colony to go and find food.
Thank you, James. Amazing. I love the ICU signal.
Yes.
and the fact that they can, your visual display on the screen will be sufficient for them to elicit. And I had a few one is, I have two questions maybe. One is there any dialect there? Because you show that it's quite precise, they need exactly the right frequency. That would suggest that maybe they also have dialects about what is the ICU signal for one hive or another area. But the other one, in your movie that you showed, it looked as if the animal on the screen was larger than the real animals. So can you compensate for size by putting the screen further away? Or how selective or how important is the size of your visual display there?
Right. So I think that was a bad picture from the perspective. They did adjust it so it was the same size as a bee. But that's a great point. We actually worked with Chris Unigin at Cornell, and we haven't finished the experiments, on what is it that actually triggers the signal. So we created animations. Two-dimensional animations, and our goal was to make a hornet that the bees didn't respond to, and to make a butterfly that appeared dangerous to the bees. And the answer seems to be pretty simple in that you saw that in that video we were taking the hornet and moving it horizontally back and forth. And that's how they fly because they're interested in trying to get into the colony. The butterfly goes like this, in a random pattern. And if we took a butterfly animation and we made it do this, then the bees would produce the ICU signal. And we had all kinds of variations. We made a butterfly look like a hornet in terms of coloration, and the hornet vice versa. So the color didn't matter. The shape probably didn't matter. It appears that it's the fact that this object is moving in a way that it appears to be interested in the colony that is what is triggering the bees. And I actually kind of like that answer because it's much more simplistic in terms of what a bee has to pay attention to.
And the size is not that relevant.
We also tried looming stimulus, and that didn't really matter as much, and we tried big versus small. That wasn't as relevant, although I think if it moved horizontally and it was larger, it appeared to be more of a threat to the bees.
Yeah, just quickly follow up on that. Because the robber bees, so when they try to rob each other, they also have this characteristic flat pattern. So do they also do the ICU signal towards robber bee, and do that deter them as well?
That's really interesting. I will have to ask Kentan if they do that for the robber bees. I haven't seen that when I was there, but I do like the idea that they are really responding to very simple sign stimuli, which the early ethologists, I think, would have loved, because it's kind of boils down to something very simple, not very complicated.
Thanks so much for the talk. I had a really quick question also about the ICU stimulus. So the synchronization I thought was really cool. So from the hornet's perspective, do they care as much about the synchronization as they do about the sheer number of bees that are on the other side? Like, is the synchronization important to them as well as the number?
So we weren't able to test that. We do know if there are few bees producing the ICU signal, the hornet will not flee. I assume that the synchronization also plays a role. It would be interesting, we haven't done this experiment, to play back a video of defending bees to the hornet to see if the hornet would respond to that. That would be, and then we could actually alter many things.
Yeah, thanks.
One more thing that you brought up that I wanted to mention is that when we did these experiments, we found that the hornet, would also elicit stop signals from bees outside the nest. And so others, one person has published on this. We don't know the function of these stop signals, whether it's simply that they are alarmed and haven't been able to rush back inside the nest, or whether somehow they coordinate the defense of bees on the outside. In the context of a hornet attacking the nest, the bees that get the stop signal are also the foragers, and that actually keeps them inside the nest. So they stay safe while the guard bees go and try to heat ball the hornet. In the context of the stop signal at the food source, the bees don't stay inside the nest. They just stop waggle dancing. And we think they actually go back, check out the food source to see if it really is dangerous, and then come back. Given that there is always a surprising and still unexplained amount of imprecision, angular divergence, in the directional information in the waggle dance, does your research indicate that bees are unable to reach a higher degree of accuracy, even although they are able to learn to a degree? So are bees able to be more accurate? So I know there are two different sides to this. One is that there's a mechanistic limitation, that bees are dancing as accurately as possible on the comb. Proponents of this hypothesis bring two pieces of evidence. Number one, if the surface is flatter and more uniform, then they will dance more accurately. Number two is, depending upon the angle of the waggle dance on the vertical surface, there are certain positions where it is easier for them to detect gravity and they are more accurate. I think it could also be true that the tuned air hypothesis is still correct, that they can alter the waggle dance when greater accuracy is required. But I don't know the way that, in other words, I think that both of these things could be true. I think the tuned air hypothesis could be correct, and I think there truly are mechanical limitations to the accuracy of the waggle dance. But it doesn't harm the bees for both of these things to be true, because when the food source is close by, they are less accurate, and that could scatter bees over a wider distance. Okay, but to answer your question, Anya, are they able to reach a higher degree of accuracy? I think on average, they're communicating as accurately as necessary, because if it was greater accuracy was required, you would expect evolution to select for that, despite the limitations of the comb surface and things like that. But thank you, great question.
Maybe I have one last question about the stop signal. I really find it fascinating the way they can tune it to small or large hornets. But they have much, much bigger predators than hornets. And you did mention that you think it's just a small threat versus large threat they're responding to, and not really not designing small hornets. Did you ever try to have even bigger things approaching the colony, and do they produce the stop signals then as well, and is it then even different then, or is it still just a large danger?
We did actually, and the biggest predator is us. So we're standing in front of the observation colony, and if you get too close, what you see is a kind of shimmering behavior, where the bees move their abdomens and their wings. So it's not the ICU signal, because this flat surface is kind of rebounding in this synchronized behavior, which has been described in Apis dorsata and also in Apis florea. In these cases, it's speculated that this particular signal has been designed for larger predators. Because florea and dorsata don't seem to form a heat ball, but in a way it does tell the predator that it has been seen. So it's like a version of the ICU signal. And you might ask, well, then what happens if they don't heat ball? Of course, they can come and sting you. And surprisingly enough, Apis florea, which is the small bee, has a really painful sting. I learned that when I was first studying them, because they nest out in the open, so I thought they wouldn't be a problem. So I think they do have effective defenses, but this kind of shimmering behavior, which you see in these 3 different species, is probably adapted towards larger predators. And in dorsata and florea, they couple this with a hissing sound. And they can kind of and it's thought that this actually is another component of it, making it more conspicuous for a predator like the Malaysian sun bear. That is, I think, what Koeniger wrote about when he published on this.
This is the ICU signal, so that you're referring to. I was asking about the stop signal.
Oh, so sorry, yeah. So, but the stop signal, does it have for the bigger predator?
Does it even happen for the bigger predator, maybe?
I don't. If the bigger predator were to attack a bee at the food source or at the nest entrance, I don't think it would produce a larger signal, but we haven't tried yet. The worst that we do, of course, is we pinch them, right? And so it's a large human predator attacking the bee. And it seems to be similar in that one graph I showed to being attacked by a spider or being attacked by a yellow jacket. So in that case, there's evidence that maybe the bigger predator doesn't matter. But this was in Apis mellifera, which doesn't seem to have a difference between stop signals for large and small predators.
I have a follow-up question on the stop signal. How long does the bee remember to stop for a site? So a spider would be at the place maybe for an hour or 2. Would the bee still have a stop signal the next day?
So no, the maximum time that a bee would produce a stop signal would be, I think we observed one bee returning and doing 250 stop signals over 1 hour, but then she stopped. And eventually these bees would come back in a day or 2 to the food source if it was still there.
I see no more questions on Zoom either. So I think please join me in thanking James again for his really great talk. And if you have any more questions, James is still around until Thursday, so you're free to come and talk with him.
Great, great to chat with you guys. Thank you.